the move by the New South Wales Parliament to look at changes to the law in relation to abortion in that state. Now, this is not an easy issue. It's not an issue where a lot of people are comfortable even talking about it. I know it's an issue where a lot of good people have very different views. Now, when I heard this week that a bill was being introduced by an independent MP and that the intention was to pass the legislation fairly promptly, some said even this week, I have to say I was a bit surprised because I didn't hear anything, and I work in politics now in the media, about changes to abortion laws in the recent March election. Nor can I say has there been much public information about what's proposed in this bill or indeed much public debate. As I said, it's a tough issue. But as a society, if we keep avoiding tough issues because we find them confronting, as well as saying, well, our MPs can't debate tough issues, I think that's precisely why we elect them, and I think that's a real problem. Someone in the Berejiklian government who has gone public today with his concerns about this legislation is the Finance Minister, the New South Wales Finance Minister and member of the State Upper House, Mr Damien Tudehope, and he joins me on the show tonight. Damien, thank you very much for your time. As I said, this is a difficult issue for a lot of people. It's a difficult issue for a lot of people. It's one where people have very strong views. But you've entered the debate today in a very brave move to say you have serious concerns with the legislation as it's proposed. What are your concerns?
Well, I have concerns on two levels, Peter, and I expressed those a bit in an article today. But you've been around politics a long time, and you would know the process which generally is adopted in relation to the development of bills in the Parliament. And the process in our Parliament is that a private member would introduce a bill, it would be second read and then would lay on the table, and on private members' day the bill would be considered when the time is available and not part of government business. The process adopted in relation to this bill, and you rightly acknowledge that there had been no forewarning that this was heading our way, was it was going to be introduced on one day, second read on the same day, and then debated to completion the following day. And standing orders, and for those who don't know what standing orders are, they're the rules that govern how debates are conducted in the Parliament, would be suspended so to allow that debate to proceed to completion. Now, I think that process was entirely designed to ensure that there was no public backlash in relation to the bill, to get it in and out of the Parliament as quickly as possible, so that there was no rancour in the community and politicians potentially would not have to answer questions from their constituents. And I must say that I think that is a significant disrespect to the constituency that politicians represent, and my first and foremost concern in relation to it was shutting down of debate and shutting down of people's opportunity to have a say. And we talk about freedom of speech and giving people an opportunity of being heard and saying things. This, in my view, was very disrespectful of people's entitlement to have a view in respect of a very contentious issue. And I acknowledge that it is very divisive and it can cause lots of upset amongst people. But we're politicians. We should be up for that sort of stuff, to be able to deal with it in a respectful manner, not only to our constituents but amongst each other.
Well, I think, and I wholeheartedly agree, if the idea is that you can't have Parliament deal with contentious issues and contentious legislation, then why have a Parliament? That's what we elect you to do. So I think, you know, in the interest of scrutiny and transparency, you would expect that this is introduced in one sitting period. It goes off for a substantial hearing, an inquiry by the relevant committee. In fact, that committee inquiry should be open to the public, as they are certainly at a federal level, so that people can come along and have the say. This was not ventilated at the recent state election, so a lot of people will feel this has crept up on them. Many will support the decriminalisation move by the independent MP today. Others will be concerned about it, you know, in any shape or form. And then there'll be more that say we're open to consideration of legalising terminations for a certain period of time, but they are very concerned perhaps with late-term abortions. It seems to me, from my reading of the legislation, Damien, just go into that issue of late-term abortions, because this seems to be legislation that goes further than what we have in other states.
Well, and in fact, the prospect of late-term abortion, and when we talk about late-term abortion, we are talking about potentially abortions up to birth. Now, I'm not aware of any circumstances where that has happened, but this bill doesn't discard it or, in fact, say that it would be illegal to be involved in such a process where it would be illegal to have an abortion a day before or 2 days before birth. And that's the really radical part of the bill, which requires some consideration, perhaps finessing, to say, well, what are the conditions that would apply in those circumstances, and have debate around what those circumstances look like, and potentially where we should amend this bill to clarify all the concerns that may be raised in respect of what is meant by late-term abortion and the circumstances where it could happen. You know, as it currently stands, the bill provides for a certificate by 2 doctors. Now, are they independent of each other? Perhaps they work in the same clinic. Are they obstetricians? What level of counselling is given? All those sort of issues which one would think would be necessary component of seeking a termination after 22 weeks. They're not spelled out in circumstances where people would be comfortable that this is an arrangement which we should be entering into blithely. And I must say that that's exactly the problem of a process which is designed to get an in and out, nothing to see here, and move on to the next thing. And that's primarily what drives me to say, well, can we have more time to at least hear from people who may have a different version, perhaps amendments that they would want to make to this bill. And can I just say one other thing? There's one really important part of this bill is the inability or for doctors to have a conscientious objection to that bill and not be required to refer to someone who will in fact carry out the procedure. Now, that is sometimes a tough point to explain to people, but a doctor who doesn't believe that a termination, say after 22 weeks, should occur, they are required to send that person to a doctor who will in fact carry out the procedure.
Yeah, let me just jump in there, Damien, if I could, Minister, if I could get into that point there.
Sure.
The reason why 22 weeks in the legislation is used as sort of the tipping point is that's the time at which a fetus, if it was born, would normally be viable or would have a good chance of being viable, i.e. the child would survive. So 22 weeks is generally that cutoff that they look at for late-term abortions. Now, what I find unusual in this legislation, bits that I've read reported, I haven't seen the primary bill, I'll look at it over the weekend, but it's not clear that going forward with an abortion after that time, a late-term abortion, it's not clear that that has anything to do with the health of the mother, that the mother's health would be jeopardised. It doesn't stop people forum shopping if they find that the first doctor says no way, there's no grounds for it, that they go looking for another doctor. It doesn't seem to be connected to something like serious fetal abnormalities or the health of mum. So again, this is where I would fear, I share your fears, this feels like it's being pushed through with lack of scrutiny about what it means at particular phases of a pregnancy.
And that's entirely right. And what I would anticipate is that the bill may be in fact improved by others who would say that there are whole lots of safeguards you would put around this, which would make it entirely a very rare event that someone would identify a medical condition or a circumstance where you could have a termination after 22 weeks. I think that's the bit that if you went to the general public and said, do you really think that it should be legal to have termination of pregnancy after 22 weeks? My view is that most of the people, although they may agree be up to 22 weeks, it's when you go over the 22 weeks that most people say we're really uncomfortable with that, and we would want very, very strong safeguards in relation to how that process is adopted and what the circumstances would be that doctors could in fact provide that termination.
Look, I think you're right, Minister, but look, because this is a conscience vote matter for the government, any MP votes with their conscience here, it's not a whipped vote, it's not a vote organised by the political parties. There seems to be a lot of haste. What is the Berejiklian government going to do about managing better scrutiny of the legislation? And a question, this is an insider one, I know, but who drafted this bill? Because it's, I think, drafted with all the upside and right to the woman and not much right to the fetus.
Well, and they're the tricky parts, is always this debate has been run on the basis of there are women's rights involved in this, and a lot of people would say, why is an old white guy on television talking about this? This is a women's issue and it's got nothing to do with people like me. But it's either, if you have a view that this is a viable life after 22 weeks, and I think that's probably what most people do think, then in those circumstances we're all entitled to a view about how we look after that life. So don't necessarily make this an identity issue. It's, in fact, there are philosophical arguments around what is the protection which we give unborn children after 22 weeks, and that's a discussion which we as a community ought to have, not just one section of the community. Now, I'd like lots of other people to be engaged in this debate. I have really big concerns about it, but I understand that there are lots of people who have quite different opinions to me. But that in itself is half the reason why we should be engaging in a much better, transparent process around it, so that when people walk away from that, they feel as though they've had a fair hearing and a fair opportunity of proposing alternatives.
Yeah, I think the best scrutiny here is plenty of time and plenty of debate and consideration. And you've got no issues with me being a male there giving a view. I think as a legislator, you've got every right to want to legislate for the most vulnerable. That's the job of a parliamentarian. And I think this is a human issue, not just a women. I think it is a women's issue, but not just a women's issue. Damien, Tudehope, thank you very much for your time tonight.
Pleasure. Thanks, Peter.